Okay, let's go ahead and get started. For those of you that joined us, thank you for joining us this morning. For those of you that will be watching this as it's broadcasted, I'm sure you're going to miss out on the live presentation and the questioning, but we'll try our best to ask the right questions so that you get the full effect of this presentation. My name is James Quintana, and I'm the education chair for the association. And again, welcome all of you. I have my company here, Quintana Investigations, and we've been in the business since 1990 and have been doing all kinds of interesting things. One thing I enjoyed doing probably the most, I shouldn't say the most, but close, was being the chief investigator for the district attorney's office. During that time, we handled lots of cases and of course handled all the felony cases for 5 counties, in the biggest counties in the state of Texas. Although they're sparsely populated, they are the big ones that border up against Mexico. We see all kinds of things, any type of felony. I have seen too many to count people that have committed murder and gotten away with it. I've seen people that have committed thefts and gotten away with it. I've also testified in lots of civil cases where I've seen people lose a lot of money, a lot of property, just because there was some evidence that they did not collect properly. And we're very fortunate today to have Mike Darling with us, who's a veteran law enforcement officer, starting his career in California, having a very successful career, doing all kinds of things around identification and collection and preservation of evidence at crime scenes. He's an expert in many areas, including a firearm trajectory reconstruction, fingerprint and palm comparisons. And he's testified in all the courts, Superior Court, Federal Court. And he's here to talk with us today. He's also, he talks about blood spatter, crime scene photography, all of that. So we're very lucky to have him. He's not only taught here in the States, but he's taught in Canada and parts of Europe. After retiring, I'm not sure if we got the first part, but he has a dream job where he owns his own forensic consulting business and works part-time for the Emmett Police Department. Just from what I've heard, and he's a great man and a great presenter, and I look forward to hearing him. And without further delay, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mike Darling, welcome.
Well, thank you, James. I'm happy to be here. And, I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you guys. So I was talking with Pat, done lots of presentations, but this is my first one over Zoom. So I am getting used to that whole concept of not really being able to see the audience. Well, I can see James right now, so I at least I got somebody I can see, But anyway, this is really I think a great opportunity. I appreciate you giving it to me. James kind of already started talking a little bit about my bio. I started in 1994 with the City of Redding Police Department, Redding, California. Been to thousands of burglaries, thousands of traffic collisions, numerous rapes, homicides, officer-involved shootings. You name it. Supervised numerous large crime scenes. I've been oversaw the crime scene budget, ordering supplies. One of the things that I did, I proposed and implemented the department change from film to digital. And for you younger folks where you've just kind of grown up with digital, film is like, what's that stuff? But at one point in time, I swore I would never leave film and go to digital. Well, I'm 100% digital and have been for well over a decade. Currently, as James mentioned, I'm working for Emmett Police Department. There, I run the property evidence room. I worked on active investigations as an investigator. I teach crime scene, TC investigations. I don't publish on my profile or, on the flyer that went out and the bio that went out. I don't publish the police department's name. The reason why is because I don't want to misconstrue in any way that they are endorsing my private business. They're totally aware of it and they're totally okay with it. But again, I just don't want there to be any conflict that somebody says, well, hey, he's saying that. No, I'm not saying that at all. As James mentioned, I've testified as an expert in Superior Court in California and in federal court. Some of the areas I've testified as an expert in were fingerprint and palm print collection and comparisons, identification, collection, and preservation of evidence at crime scenes, blood spatter interpretation, firearm trajectory reconstruction. I've consulted on evidence as far away as Canada, lectured in Europe and the US. I'm an expert in photogrammetry, crime scene photography, diagramming. There's just a lot. Basically, what I was a generalist. And in today's world, most people become a specialist, but the nature of my work was such I had to be a generalist. So today, we're going to be talking about trying to focus on collection of evidence and packaging. There's a lot of things we could talk about. I'm going to touch on some other topics, but most of those are topics that would be better for a different class. I'm talking fast because I have a lot of ground to cover. So please bear with me on that. The other thing is I'm not sure if I'm the main screen right now or not. I know the main screen I see is James. So Pat, I don't know, you're the expert on who's which, on the main screen. It doesn't matter until we get to the PowerPoint, and we're not quite there, so we're good. Most of the training classes that I've done in the past have been for law enforcement agencies. So trying to adapt this material for the PI world, there's also an expectation on my part that you'll take the info and adapt it to your practice also. None of this stuff that we're covering is rocket science. Like you mentioned, though, James, you've seen a lot of cases that were muffed up because agencies didn't collect evidence properly, didn't preserve it properly. And that's been my experience both on the public and the private side. And on the private side, most of my work is reviewing other agencies' work and seeing where they've messed up, where they haven't collected properly, or they didn't do the job thoroughly. And that's going to kind of be the emphasis of my talk today, is just partly doing it right, but also making sure that if you're working on a case and making sure that everybody else did it right. And I've had some people say, well, aren't you pro law enforcement? Yes, I'm very pro law enforcement. I'm currently active in law enforcement and I love my job there. But my mission is to help law enforcement do a better job. And if I'm examining a case on the private side and they've done the job right, that's what I'll say. And if they've done the job wrong, well, then again, I'm hoping that by me pointing out some of what they've done incorrectly, that they'll do a better job next time and to improve the overall quality. So let's see if I can move to the PowerPoint now. It says share screen. And we're going to do this and share. And let's see. There we go. I think we're up.
You're good.
Okay, good. Well, just me. You don't need to see any more about me. Let's talk about purposes. Why look for evidence? Well, the primary reason we look for evidence is to establish a link between the crime and the suspect or victim. But there's the question I always ask when I'm doing training: what are we ultimately looking for when we say we're looking for evidence? And I'm open to people responding to this. I actually want you to respond. So you have to unmute your microphones and tell me, what do you think that we are ultimately looking for when we're looking for evidence? Any input? Especially James. James, you did a lot of different investigations. What are we looking for? You're muted.
All right. Is James talking?
Yeah, James is talking, but he's
Okay.
muted.
All right. He's talking away. Well, I'll jump in while he's trying to figure that out.
Okay.
Aren't we looking for a way to put the pieces of the puzzle together so that once or if it gets to court, we have the evidence they need to build the case properly?
Okay, you're touching on it, but there's a root principle or root thought that I'm looking for. Don't feel bad. I love posing this question because nobody ever gets, or rarely does anybody ever get it. So, James.
Looking for an affirmative link between what took place and who did it?
Actually, something more basic. So, Will, in the interest of time, I'll move on and tell you what I'm looking for the answer. Ultimately, we're looking for the truth. And the reason why I emphasize this is because I've seen so many investigators. I like using this illustration. They get a theory, they fall in love with it, they get engaged to it, they get married to it, and then they refuse to divorce it no matter what happens. And it doesn't matter what the evidence says, they are in love with this theory. And that's where we have to step back and say, what are we ultimately looking for? We're ultimately looking for the truth. And I've had discussions with city attorneys before when the city's gotten sued over, crash where the city had some stuff going on with it. And the attorney give me a hard time. Well, why'd you photograph this? It makes the city look guilty. And I'm going, well, that's my job. And they're saying, well, yeah, but it makes the city look bad. And you work for, no, I work for the city, but the city hires me to find the truth, not to make them look good. And that's ultimately what I see that we're looking for. Okay, so a little bit of an overview. What is and what is not evidence? Pat kind of touched on this a little bit. Evidence is anything that moves you closer to knowing the truth of what happened. This can be witness statements. It can be physical evidence, fingerprints, DNA, bullet trajectories, scene layout, documents. I think in Pat's work, there's a lot more of the documents involved. It can be anything. Anything on this planet can be evidence because that's where all of our cases happen, is on this planet. What is not? Well, that's hard to say. Many law enforcement agencies, they either collect not enough stuff or they collect too much. And that's the thing where when you're collecting evidence, you have to look at, how does this impact my case? What is the potential value of this evidence? I had one homicide that I worked where supervisor one, it was an area where a lot of transient folks hung out. And so there was trash everywhere. And he wanted every single piece of trash from that entire half-acre hillside area collected. Well, number one, that's not going to be probative because anybody could be out there and leave trash behind. And number two, the state lab was no way were they going to process that several hundred pieces of evidence for DNA or fingerprints, that kind of thing. So it was a waste of several man hours, but this can happen. Yeah, our focus today is going to be mostly on collection and packaging. So what you're going to look for depends on the type of case that you're working on. If it's a physical case, burglary, rape, homicide, one of the things I like to do is to imagine the events at the scene, kind of like a movie. And those of you that have watched the CSI show, this is something where they'll take and the CSIs there, they develop a theory and then they play a little video of how they see that theory working out. And that's something I have done for many, many years, long before the show came out. I'm at a scene and I'm trying to see how it's going to work, or particularly trajectory scenes. And so I'm picturing in my mind, how did this go down? And that helps me to kind of get an idea, well, could it have gone down the way we think? Or is that physically impossible? Look for things that don't feel right. Your subconscious will be processing that scene faster than your conscious is. And so if something doesn't feel right, where the little voice is saying, I need to spend more time, do it. Look for what doesn't feel right. Look for patterns. I've been in houses that were just a complete, total, absolute hoarding mess. Best way I can describe it. And people say, oh, this is a mess. And then they discount everything at the scene. No, even hoarders have a system quite often. And there's one homicide that I worked where we were able to isolate which firearm, because there were firearms missing, which firearm is the one that probably killed him. And that was all based on learning the system that this guy had. He was a hoarder. So look for patterns. Look for things that are overlooked. Investigators tend to get in a hurry. And that's the thing with most sworn law enforcement. They're in a hurry. They got to get out there. They want to get the next arrest. They want to move on. And the idea of spending the next 12 to 16 hours at a scene is totally foreign to them. So it's easy for them to overlook stuff or to make assumptions and then come to the wrong conclusions. Okay. Collection and packaging. One of the things that we need to be aware of is the ISP, since we're here in the state of Idaho, the Idaho State Police Guidelines on Evidence Submission. After the seminar, I'll have an email that I'll send out that has a handout. It has a copy of the Idaho State Police Guidelines on Evidence Submission. So the question is, why is that important to us? Because we're working in the private sector. The reason why that's important is because when you go to court, and Pat mentioned court, there is going to be a prosecutor that if he's doing his job at all and you've collected any evidence, he is going to hold you to that standard because that is the best practices standard. The other reason to be familiar with it and understand it is because working on the private side, if you're looking over a criminal case where there's evidence and the evidence wasn't collected properly by the ISP guidelines, that gives you a good foothold into questioning how that case is working out. Important thing, wear clean latex or nitrile gloves when you're collecting evidence. Change them often, especially when it comes to DNA. We'll talk about DNA a little bit later. Use new paper bags, not plastic. There are very, very, very few items that should ever be collected in plastic. The reason why, plastic sweats. And so it can ruin DNA evidence. It can ruin fingerprint evidence. Use paper bags or paper envelopes, manila envelopes. If you, on the private side, are collecting evidence and it's not something that's going to be DNA sensitive, you can use a used paper grocery bag, and that is fine. The ideal, of course, would be new bags. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Give you an example of improper packaging. Happened right here in the state of Idaho, case that I worked. There was a gal that claimed that her ex-boyfriend had drugged her and maybe or maybe not did some other things to her. Supposedly he drugged an energy drink and gave it to her. She'd thrown it away in the trash. And so she went home, dug it out of the trash. Law enforcement came to her place. She gave them the can. And so with law enforcement, they didn't ask if there were any other cans in the trash, if she had other energy drinks. They didn't search the trash. And that was just that was a weak point on their investigation, because they should have gone and searched her trash and enunciated that in their report that, hey, this could be the only can that was used, because this was the only can in her trash that matched this description. Then to make it worse, they threw the can in a plastic bag, and there was like many soda cans, beer cans, juice cans, any kind of a can, there was a little bit of liquid left inside the can. So they shipped it off to the state lab. The lab did find drugs in the liquid that was left. However, they couldn't test for fingerprints, hers or his. They couldn't test for DNA because the sticky stuff inside the can had leaked out of the can and sloshed around all over the can and ruined it for any kind of other testing. And that, to me, that was a major flaw in the case there. What they should have done was to have taken whatever liquid is left, poured it into a snap vial. They should have small little vials. Any kind of a tiny plastic container would work, but most law enforcement agencies can get from the state lab or from a private supplier. They can get these little snap vials that they put when they do their syringe, they'll empty syringe contents into these snap vials. So it's a very common thing. We talked about paper bags. These are paper bags that are available. Searchy is one of the suppliers. I'm going to email out a list of suppliers for forensic supplies. There's many, many out there. The ones that I'm going to email out are the ones that I've used the most over the years. But this is an evidence bag. It gives room for a description of the property, chain of custody. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And here is a copy of the state envelope. It's an evidence envelope you can use for evidence or drugs. On the private side, you won't be having these because these are provided by the state. But again, the information on here gives you an idea of what is expected to be placed on the bag. So if you are collecting stuff on the private side and you're using plain paper bags, which are fine, you can get them at a grocery supplier, things like that. But this is the kind of evidence that you want to have on there. Like I said, we'll talk about state. We'll talk about the chain of custody a little bit later. Okay, a little bit more moving down the list.
If I may, real quick, Mike, I'm sorry.
Sure.
The screen, I don't know if it's frozen on my end, but I'm still looking at it's in the bag on the screen.
Oh, then it's frozen on your end because I'm moving along. Anybody
here.
else see? We should be
Yes.
on a slide,
Okay.
James. We're good.
No, we're still, it's in the bag.
Oh, well, then somehow it's not sharing my screen. It says I'm screen sharing. Tell you what, I'm going to stop the share and then go back to start the share screen again
Thank you.
and
Good catch,
see.
Matt.
Okay. Now, do you see a screen that says
Yes.
collection and packaging?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, then let's real quick, we'll just back up for a moment. If my computer will let me. That didn't want to let me back up. I don't know why. It did yesterday when I tested all this stuff. So anyway, collection and packaging. One of the things you want to do is seal all openings with packaging tape or evidence tape. ISP requires for evidence that's submitted to them that it be evidence tape. The reason why is it's very fragile and any tampering will show. On a lot of agencies, and one of the things I do at work is I'll still use packaging tape, but then I put evidence tape over the top of that. The reason why I use the packaging tape first on paper bags is it holds better. Just makes for a sturdier seal. Signer, initial, and date the seals. One of the, now let's see if it's, well, this is now mine, my thing is frozen. Okay. Let's see, I'm frozen on that one. So now then why? Okay, we're going to start the thing over and see if that works. And no,
Mike,
that's
you're
not-
you're yourself trying to scroll down, right? As you change screens and it's not letting you-
yes,
Okay,
yes, but let me get back to here. And no, this is technology. You got to either hate it or love it.
I hate it.
And yeah, it's a love-hate thing with me. Okay, here we go. Now I'll go back to share screen. Get to there. I think I know what happened, why mine froze.
That's a collection packaging that we're seeing.
There we go. Okay, now let's see if this progresses. There we go. Okay, do you see an evidence seal on the screen?
Now we see collection and packaging.
Oh, no, it's not I don't know why it's not, the screen sharing is not progressing. Okay, so let's just do this and do this. This isn't going to, I'm not sure why it's freezing on this, but we'll make it work. So
There it
now
is.
this is an example of an evidence seal. It should have a signature or initials. I prefer signature over initials
Mhm.
and a date. And that's an important thing to have on every seal. So now my screen.
You literally have my initials. That's awesome.
Well, that's my signature. That's my work signature. That's not my normal, that's another story.
Yeah, it actually looks like my initials.
Okay, well, then that works. Okay, now I'm going to try to get back to this. This thing is just not I don't know why we're having so many problems with this, but that's okay. We're gonna,
Mike, I wanted to ask you while you're trying to figure that out. You said
Yeah.
you were going to email the links that you use for certain.
yes,
Okay,
yes.
Great, great.
Yeah, I'm gonna email that out. I'm a strong proponent of emailing out follow-up handouts with, it's not a lot, but it's information that we talked about, because for everybody to try and write down everything from the screen as I progress through stuff is kind of difficult,
Oh, yeah, I
So-
appreciate that.
you know. What not to do. Hopefully you guys can see that.
Yep.
Don't roll the bag or package down tight around the evidence. Don't mix evidence in packages. When in doubt, package it separately. Habit of a lot of folks is they have a lot of evidence to collect, so they just start stuffing everything all into one bag. And this is particularly bad if you get into DNA stuff. So now here you should see a picture of a bag. Anybody see that?
Nope.
Now, oh man, this thing is just,
Just trying to keep you on your toes.
oh yeah, yeah. Well, we'll just see here. Okay, see a picture of a bag now.
Yep.
Yes.
This is a common thing. People will stuff stuff into a bag and then they roll it down nice and tight because it makes a nice, pretty little package. Don't do that. The reason why is because if it has to be opened up later for analysis, how are you going to open that without cutting the seal? And then how are you going to stuff the evidence back in that pretty little bag and reseal it? And believe me, I've been there many, many, many times and it's a pain. Okay, this thing just does not want to, let's see here. We'll do this again. We'll just, if I have to jump back and forth between screen sharing and everything, we'll just do it and see what we got to do to make it happen. Nope, that's not working. Well,
As
Yeah.
someone, as far as on the evidence, once the seal is on there and you put the time and date, would you advise also making notation as far as like what room it was found in case?
yes,
there's-
location and I'm actually gonna, I'll talk about it now. I'm gonna touch on it a little bit later, but let's talk about that now for a moment. When you're collecting, you should be making in your notes. Now you can note on the bag, but you should be making in your notes also where you collected evidence, where it's from, things like that. What I see is really common in law enforcement, especially if they've got a big scene with a lot of guys working the scene, is you'll have 3 or 4 guys searching a room, and you'll have one guy that's designated as the collector or the finder. And so they're collecting all this evidence, they're finding it, and they're handing it to him, and he's packaging it up. And then it comes to court several years later, true story, and homicide case, and the defense attorney asks, well, where did you find this item? Because you're located, you're here on the bag as the finder. And he explains the process. Well, we had several people searching. I was the finder for the room. I packaged everything up. Well, where was it found? In that room. Well, where? Under the bed, in the closet, in the dresser? I don't know. Well, who actually found it? I don't know. Okay. There's just no way to sell that in court. There's just no good way to sell that. So it is important. Note on the bag. That's one of the things that I train on is note on the bag, note in your report exactly where you found it. And finding it at 790 Washington Street is not the answer. It's, I found it in the master bedroom in the closet. You want to be very, very specific. And I was going to touch on that a little bit when we talk about documentation. And the other thing to do is, I think, and this is what I train when I train at the police department, is ask yourself, well, what questions could be asked to challenge this as you're collecting the evidence? And that's why I train these guys. So, well, what would a good defensive investigator ask about this evidence that you've collected? And I try to get them thinking into that mind frame, because court, as Pat mentioned earlier, is where we eventually end up. So does that help a little bit?
I loved it. I wrote that down. That's so fabulous.
And also time, and I'm sure you'll get to that later, Mike. as far as the time that it was
A
collected?
time, I'm not a big fan of noting the time unless for some reason in the case it's specific. I like to note the time that I arrive on scene and the time that I leave, but I usually don't note the specific time that I find something or collect something. And if that's something you feel is important, by all means do it. It's not wrong. It's not bad. I just find I usually have myself pretty busy with noting everything else I've got going on. And the other thing that I do a lot of is, and we're going to touch on photography, but not talk a lot about it. I take a lot of photos, and my photos have a timestamp. And so I make sure the clock in my camera, I'm not using a cell phone, I'm using a DSLR. My timestamp on my photos is accurate, and my photos quite often are my notes. So, and that's another whole class talking about photography. Let's talk a little bit about DNA considerations. DNA, an important thing to remember about DNA is that it's not like puzzle pieces. It's more like soup. Okay. A lot of people think that it's like puzzle pieces where, well, you look in this can and there's some green pieces and some blue pieces and some yellow pieces, red pieces, you pull them all out, you put the red pieces together, the green pieces together, so forth, and you have your puzzle solved. No, it's like if you take a bunch of chili and some clam chowder and some gumbo and some beef stew and pour it all into a coffee can and shake it slightly, not completely, but slightly, and then start trying to separate it out. Well, yes, there are going to be some parts you can pull out and say, yeah, this is gumbo. This is probably clam chowder. This is vegetable beef, but you're never going to be able to separate it completely. And that's the way DNA is. So what you want to look for is for items that will have a preponderance of one person's DNA, and don't mix items. If you collect an item with DNA in mind, that is the only item in that package. Had a case where officer had a great thought process until it came to packaging. He's at a burglary. They found a cigarette butt on the master bedroom floor. The victim says, I don't smoke. My wife doesn't smoke. Nobody we know smokes. There's no reason for that cigarette butt to be here. Now that is prime DNA evidence. So the officer collects it in a little coin envelope. That's wonderful. Then he's talking to the victim, and the victim says, I think it's one of those dirt bags that lives across the street. They're always hanging out there smoking, causing trouble, doing dope and all, just the usual stuff. So he goes over there and there's cigarette butts everywhere. So he finds a couple cigarette butts of the same brand as the one that found in the house. Okay, that's wonderful. He drops them in the same coin envelope as the cigarette butt he collected from the master bedroom. Well, now they're contaminated. They're of no value whatsoever. And yes, you could test them for DNA and show that all three had the same DNA. And the first thing that I would do as a defense investigator is say, well, they're cross-contaminated. And how do you know is which one? It's just totally ruined the evidence. A little bit about touch DNA versus saliva, blood, semen, wear DNA. Touch DNA is where something is just touched or handled by a person. The state lab will process touch DNA, but only for homicide or sexual assault cases. Private labs, hey, you can get a private lab to test anything you want if you want to pay the money, but it's not cheap. Saliva, blood, semen, wear DNA are all the best sources of DNA. And that comes from things like sunglasses, ball caps, shirts, obviously blood, semen, that stuff's obvious stuff. But something that has a large amount of DNA in it. Another thing about sealing packages, don't seal all the factory sealed seams on an envelope or bag. And see can you see a picture here?
No.
Nope. Okay, I'm going to show this real quick. Man, this thing is, we'll get there. We'll get there. Let's see. Go to here. One of the things that I see some people do is they will take and seal every single seam on a package like this. Don't do that. Okay, it's not necessary. You only need to seal where the opening was. And that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, now I have to stop share, Get this back to here. And that's good. Okay. Now then. Yeah.
Idea to actually tape the seams of the bag.
Oh, yes, yes. That is a common thing that some people are trained to do.
Okay,
State lab does not like it at all, because how do they get into that bag and reseal it up without taping over those other seams or in that other tape? And so they don't like it at all, but that is a common thing. So let's talk a little bit about chain of custody and storage. Purpose of a chain of custody is to document who had access to the item. This is one thing that I see a lot of law enforcement agencies mess up on. They will either document too much on the chain of custody or they don't document enough. Sometimes I've seen chain of custodies turned in where it says store clerk A gave this to store clerk B, store clerk B gave this to store clerk C, store clerk C gave it to the manager, manager gave it to me, and then I booked it as evidence. Well, that all should be in the report, not on the chain of custody. Chain of custody has to do with when it comes into your possession. And you are signing saying, I take possession of this. And when I release it, I am signing saying I am releasing it to somebody else. And a lot of law enforcement agencies get very casual about passing stuff around until it finally gets packaged as evidence. And that's not good. So that's something to watch for, whether or not they've documented. Again, kind of back to our idea of the finder. Well, who handled this before it came into your possession, officer so-and-so? Store evidence in a location that you can document that only you have access to. This is where I see people on the private side mess up if they collect evidence. Why, I locked it in my office. Well, does your wife have a key to that? Well, of course. Well, then it was not secure. It needs to be in a cabinet or a closet, something where you can say you are the only one with access to that spot. If you need, oh man, I've got stuff. These last two lines aren't supposed to, I don't know how my presentation is. These are supposed to be on our DNA collection side. So anyway, we'll move on. Okay, can you see swabs? No? Okay. Man. Okay. Well, I'll fix it. It's supposed to be about DNA consideration here. And DNA collection. I'm going to move on, get to DNA. Man. Well, this is not. Now something's all messed up. Don't worry. We'll work with it. We're going to talk about swabs and DNA collection. And let's just do this here. Here we go. Okay. A little bit about DNA collection. You do need to wear clean gloves. Change them all the time. Each specimen has to be packaged separately. Use sterile swabs. I've got an example here of cotton-tipped wood applicators, sterile swabs. You can see the front of the package, the back of the package, and they need to be packaged either in a swab box or a brand new manila coin envelope or regular manila envelope. The thing about DNA is just to keep in mind, you do not want any kind of cross-contamination, period. So be very, very careful. Don't use Q-tips or swabs from a large package unless you can enunciate in your report that, and you do document in your report that it was from a sealed, unopened package. Nothing wrong with using store-bought Q-tips, but essentially it's going to be a one scene use. You open that package of Q-tips, use them for that scene, and then you take the rest home to use at home, but you can't use them for evidence collection again because you can't document and prove that they were clean and sterile. So that's just something to keep in mind with DNA collection. That's one of the things with on the law enforcement side, if somebody's collecting swabs quite often, they won't document all this. And so I like to ask, well, where did these swabs come from? Were they in a sealed package? Were they sterile? You know, did you You know, a lot of times some law enforcement agencies try to save money, so they'll use a very large package of swabs and then just use that from, you know, one scene to the next. Well, my question then is, how can you prove that these were not contaminated? Because they've obviously, once the package is open, they're exposed to whatever you expose them to. Let's talk here. Move on to the next
One
one.
question, Mike,
Yeah, sure.
with the liquid or like DNA, how about air drying? As far
Air
as-
drying. Okay, we're gonna, yeah, we need, sorry, my presentation got mixed up here and I did have that on a slide. Thank you for reminding me. Let's go back to this. When you, depending on what you're swabbing, if you're dry swabbing, there's no need to air dry at all because they're dry. If you're wet swabbing, you can air dry them, but then the problem becomes, how do you air dry them without potential contamination? What I like to do is to place them in a swab box. The swab box you see on your screen there does not have any holes in it, and I don't use this brand anymore unless I punch a hole in them. You can punch a hole in the side of that swab box and then put it in a manila envelope, and the swabs will dry. If you do have to moisten a swab for evidence collection, say you've got some dried blood, use distilled water. Have a dropper bottle of distilled water. Don't use tap water. I mean, you can if you have to, but it's far better to use distilled water because it's not going to have any contaminants in it. If you're collecting wet samples like blood, or you're collecting a DNA reference sample like a saliva cheek swab, again, those will dry inside of a swab box with the holes in it. But then that needs to be inside of another paper envelope or a manila envelope before you package it with other swab boxes. Each item needs to be separate. And does that help?
Yes, sir.
Okay. One of the things that I do see with law enforcement is just this idea of not keeping things separated with DNA. And the other thing I see with DNA is don't talk over the top of it. When you're collecting stuff for DNA, you need to keep your trap shut. You know, a lot of people say, well, I know I'm not supposed to sneeze or cough over it. Well, don't talk either. Because, and I've actually had documented cases where the state lab people's DNA showed up on evidence because they were talking over the top of the evidence while they were processing it at the lab. Which now that lab doesn't talk anymore while they have evidence out. But that was an actual case. Gosh, it's been probably 15, maybe 20 years ago now. But that was one thing we learned the hard way. So when you're talking, you're spewing DNA. So when you're collecting DNA evidence, don't talk. And if you got somebody with you that's helping you and they want to yak while you're collecting, yeah, tell them, hey, please don't talk. I'm collecting DNA. Turn your face away. Even while you're telling them that, turn your face away from the stuff you're working on. When I first started, in order to collect DNA, you had to have a sample of blood the size of a quarter in order to get DNA. Now you don't have to have anything visible and you can get DNA. So it has progressed and changed, and it's going to get to the point, and I'm glad that I'm on the retired side, where people are going to have to wear moon suits when they're going into crime scenes to protect, because the DNA is going to be so sensitive. And I'm happy. I've been there, done that, don't like to wear moon suits. And so I'm glad that I'm more on the retired direction of the whole thing. So any other questions about DNA while we're there?
I have a question in general about gloves. You say change them often. You've repeated
Yes.
that. What does often mean to you?
Well, it depends on what you've handled. If you're collecting swabs and you've just handled the wooden shaft of the swab and you're collecting from different locations, you don't have to change your gloves from from item to item. But let's say you're collecting pieces of clothing that you're actually handling with your gloves have now been contaminated with DNA. So when you roll up that piece of clothing and put it into a bag, you need to take your gloves off and put on a clean set of gloves for the next thing.
Okay.
So it's just something to keep in mind. I've seen on the whole biohazard thing, and I haven't even gotten into that today. I've seen guys take and handle a bunch of bloody clothing, stuff it in a bag, and then handle the outside of the bag and use their ink pen to write on the outside of the bag, and write on their paperwork. And then they take their gloves off and they pick all that stuff up and walk out of the room. Well, everything they just touched is contaminated with biohazards. And the way I like to think of it is just pretend that everything is contaminated with biohazards and you're not wanting to contaminate yourself. So if you handle an item that's going to possibly be used for DNA, then change your gloves and use fresh gloves before you do anything else. So does that help?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, good. Okay, let's see. Can you see a sample chain of custody on your screen?
No,
Probably not. Okay, well, let's get out of that. Get up to, boy, well, maybe try it. This whole thing. I have no idea why this thing's not letting us do our stuff, but that's okay. And in fact, it says, I'm going to try share screen. Okay. Let's go here. Okay, you see a sample chain of custody up there. Good, okay. This is a sample chain of custody. I gotta watch our time here so I make sure I get through stuff. Okay. Okay. There it shows a from, a to, and a date. This is from one of the state drug envelopes that the state provides to a lot of law enforcement agencies. But the from would be if you're passing this off to a coworker, or you're putting it into evidence, like in my job, I'll put stuff into evidence, which I'm evidence. But anyway, you'll sign saying that you're releasing it, and then whoever accepts it will sign saying on the to line, and then they'll date it. And then when they release it, whether they're releasing it to another person or to the court or to an attorney or whoever, they'll sign releasing it. And then the person that is accepting it will sign on the to line, and they date it. Now, some chain of custodies will have space for a time, like James asked about earlier. This one does not. Overall, time is not usually a consideration. But again, if it is, you can always add the time. Or if it's something you feel that is important, you can always add the time. So, sources of supplies. Can you see that list? It's not critical that you see. It's not a major list anyway. Forensic supply houses. I'm going to send a list of forensic supply houses out in the handout. You can get evidence tapes, swab boxes, that kind of thing from them. Their catalogs are fun to get anyway, and you see what all's available. Medical supply houses, that's where I get my swabs. Don't buy your swabs from a forensic supply house. They buy them from the medical supply houses, mark them up a lot, and then resell them to you. So if you're going to buy the swabs bulk, buy them from online from a medical supply house, or go down to the drugstore. Like I said, you can use Q-tips and things as long as you can enunciate it's a brand new container. Grocery supply is good for paper bags. Office supply businesses are good for coin envelopes and bags. Let's talk a little bit about documentation. Your reports, photos, and diagrams should make it so that someone who's never been to the scene could 20 years later recreate the scene. That's the kind of details you need to have. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about reports, but they need to be detailed and thorough. I like to use my photos for notes, but you should just have a chronological walkthrough of everything that you did. Don't assume that everyone knows this location, because they don't, and places change. And a case might not go to court for 5 or 10 years, and by that time that place could be totally gone or changed. Your reports need to be written for the average person to understand. Beware of technical or occupational language. It's very easy for us to use language that we know what it means, but it's not It's not something the general public is going to understand. So stay away from technical language. One of the things about details in your documentation is you need to be very detailed, not just, well, I got fingerprints from the exterior of the car. Okay, well, that may or may not be evidentiary. But if you have a little diagram on your fingerprint card and you enunciate that this was taken from the driver's side door, now it may be evidentiary. You find a cigarette butt. Okay, you found it on the sidewalk outside the business. That may or may not be evidentiary because it's a public location. But if you have a video of that cigarette butt being thrown down and you collect it a few hours later and you do a search and there's no other cigarette butts in a 30-foot radius from that cigarette butt, now that cigarette butt, even though it's in a public place, becomes very evidentiary. So documentation can make or break the validity of evidence. A little bit about photography. And you probably can't see my slide on the screen, and we're not going to worry about it just for time. Because I'm going to basically tell you what it says. DSLR is best. Cell phone cameras are okay. You're just going to have more detail with a DSLR camera. Use the highest quality setting available in a common format, like JPEG. Do not, if you have an Apple phone, do not use the Apple HEIC. Okay, that is a proprietary format, and it can't be viewed by non-Apple equipment unless you convert it. And then in converting, you're just setting yourself up for issues. So if you're using a cell phone and it's an Apple phone, use the JPEG format. The way it'll ask you is you want to use the, I think it's highest quality versus most compatible. Most compatible is what you want to choose. And sometimes, you think, well, I want highest quality. No, in this case, you want most compatible. Take photos from every angle. You may discover something important in the photos later. Use a scale or a ruler in all your close-up photos. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about photography because that's a whole separate presentation in and of itself. Documentation, measurements, and diagrams. Your need for diagrams may vary. I find here in Idaho, the courts are not using diagrams as much as I'm used to them being used. I think they're a phenomenal tool. Diagram gives the jury a good overview of the scene. They can be hand-drawn or computer-drawn. And I want to show you a couple diagrams here. Make sure that this, get up to, I want to show you the diagram. If I get it to give me, oh, there's meeting controls. Okay, we're going to stop share. And okay, here we go. Okay, let's see. You guys see a diagram?
See the trajectory.
Trajectory reconstruction.
Yeah, this is a trajectory reconstruction. It was done from photos. This is something that I do a lot of, is reconstructions just from the photos because I wasn't at the scene. The reconstruction, the initial photos, the first two photos were done by a state agency in another state. They did do a partial trajectory reconstruction on the truck that you see in the first two photos. And then the third photo is one of mine, and it's from the shooter's vehicle, the windshield from the shooter's vehicle. So I was asked to do a trajectory reconstruction because the issue was, where was the truck and trailer at the point in time the gentleman, I use the term loosely, the gentleman in the other vehicle fired at the truck. And his premise was the guy was trying to run him off the road with the trailer. Well, that's for the courts to decide whether that was a valid excuse or not. But the trajectory reconstruction showed that the trailer, it was a long 16-foot bed car trailer. The trailer had to be next to the little Nissan at the time that the truck started moving over. And there's a lot more to the story, but just leaving that just for that. Okay, now can you see another diagram?
Not yet.
Okay, then I'm going to stop share and start share again. Let's just do it this way. And then you'll have the diagram. We'll make it work this way. Okay, this is a diagram of a homicide scene. The entire lot is showing the movements of the people. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this diagram, but it was very effective with the jury for them to see the overall scene. And now let's see if I can get, oh, come on. Okay, there we go. Shared window. Let me get back to here and see if this, and I want to show you another diagram. This is the same one, only close up, and we get that. Okay, this is the same thing, only close up. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this was very effective showing the movements of the perpetrators through the house, well, actually single perpetrator, the movement of the two victims and the one perpetrator through the house. Incidentally, this is the bloodiest scene I've ever worked in. Even the people from the state lab that came out said this was the bloodiest scene they'd ever seen. It was a mess. But this is just one way of showing the jury the overall picture, because I had thorough pictures of the house, but how do you put it all together? And diagrams can be very, very effective for that. And so that's just should be part of your documentation. I think that once attorneys see the actual benefit of diagrams, I think they'll probably use them more. I've just seen a reluctance, or, maybe it's not, well, how's a diagram going to help me? And even that last one with the trajectory, the defense attorney, and this is in another state, but the defense attorney is, well, how's the diagram going to help me? And I think this is actually a very useful tool, not just for the attorneys, but for the jury to see also. So kind of wrapping up, things commonly missed and common errors. Chain of custody, we've talked about that. I see chain of custody being ignored all the time. Evidence collection and packaging, I see that messed up, especially where I came from. I saw guys who get lazy. As one lieutenant put it when I'm talking to him, well, your package wasn't sealed. It was a homicide case. Well, I was in a hurry. Well, it doesn't matter if you were in a hurry. It doesn't matter at all. It's a homicide. It needs to be done right. So, and let's see, can you guys see a question mark there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Well, hey, I think I figured out how to make this thing work. Anyway, the other thing that I've seen is with trajectories. People make assumptions. Well, I got a bullet hole here. I got a bullet hole there. There's my trajectory. It's all good. And I had one case that I worked extensively on, considered an attempt homicide case. The law enforcement agency basically said, yeah, we got bullet holes. We're good. And they didn't do a trajectory reconstruction or anything. And as soon as I'm reading the report, I'm looking at the size of the vehicles and the placement of the bullet holes in the vehicle. And I'm just going, couldn't have happened. Absolutely physically impossible. But they just made the assumption. They got married to the idea this kid was good for it, and they ran with it. And the people at that agency, they could have called out their crime scene people to do the trajectory reconstruction. I mean, I know the people well. They're friends of mine. I didn't work for that agency, but the people working there are friends of mine, and they could have figured it out right at the beginning, but they didn't. And so I see that on both sides, the private and the public side, the tendency to not follow through and check everything out, just make assumptions. So that's something to look for as you're evaluating cases. Did they just make assumptions, or did they follow through? And on my side, working in law enforcement, that's one of the things I do when I get the preliminary report from an officer and I'm looking at stuff. If they didn't follow through, then I know that on the investigation side, now I've got to go back and clean up their mess and finish it. But there's just a lot of that. People get in a hurry and they get careless. And so none of this stuff's rocket science. It's just taking the time to look it over and look it over with, I guess, an open mind. So anyway, questions. I could talk all day, but I know we're short on time. So
Now, Very good, Mike. That was outstanding. One thing that I've seen in private investigations, coming from a law enforcement background, is, and I'd like you to explain to everybody, is the difference between having a theory and having tunnel vision.
Okay. Theories are ideas where, and you should have multiple theories. And they're a way that you try to make sense of the evidence. But tunnel vision is where you get focused either on one theory or one piece of evidence and you exclude everything else. And that's the problem. Don't exclude evidence, because sometimes you'll have conflicting evidence. I had an officer involved shooting where there was conflicting evidence and they got tunnel vision. And I had a theory. It was totally different than the majority of everybody else's. And I had the fortune to be able to talk to the officer a few years later off the record and find out, yeah, my theory was correct. And they got tunnel vision. And it can happen. And there was nothing wrong with the shooting. It wasn't like it was a bad shoot. But we're not just looking to see, is it a good or bad shoot? We're looking to see an officer involved shooting. We want to know the truth, not just is it a good or bad shoot, but we want to know exactly what happened. And that should be with any case. So don't get locked in, don't get tunnel vision and get locked into one theory. Be open to different explanations. And if something doesn't make sense, keep looking, keep thinking. So.
Absolutely. And I think that comes along with being an ethical investigator. In that
Yes.
sometimes you go out and you're hired by somebody. And the important thing is that if it gets to court, you tell the truth, not
Right.
just, okay, my husband is doing whatever, that you look into it to find out exactly what's going on. Instead of a he said, because you'd rather give them this information now than to go to court. And then you go and do
Exactly.
your presentation. And then you find out that you had tunnel vision and you look like a fool in front of the judge.
Oh,
In front of
absolutely.
anybody else. And it gives you a bad reputation. And also
Oh,
I
yeah.
feel is unethical.
Well, and you lose your case, even if your case was good, was a righteous case, you lose it because you've just lost credibility.
Hmm.
So that's why I tell, on the private side, I tell prospective clients, I said, my job here is to work on the truth. And if my work helps you, I'm totally happy. And if my work doesn't help you, I'm sorry, but that's the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great thing to say. I also say, wouldn't you rather me tell it to you than have a judge tell it to you when
Oh,
your
yeah.
kids are in the balance?
Yep, exactly. Exactly.
Let's see. Anybody else have any other questions?
Mike, hey, this is Chris.
Yeah.
Hey, so, and I know you didn't want to dive into photographs or videos, so I can hit you up at a different time, but one of the things that I struggle with, and I haven't been called on it yet, but as far as preserving photographs, video, the majority of evidence I collect is either statements, photographs, audios, and videos.
Mhm.
And when I worked for the police department, of course, there was a certain process you follow to preserve, collect, and store all of that information.
Right.
What is there any type of recommendation for the private investigator as far as preserving that, collecting and preserving, so it's can't be questioned if and when you go to court on it? You're
Yeah.
storing it on your private drive, is there issues with that? Can it be questioned later as far as the authenticity of the video, the date and time stamp?
Yeah, it can, no matter what you do, even on the law enforcement side, it can be questioned.
All right,
A lot of law enforcement agencies use specific software that will preserve a specific date, timestamp, and chain of custody on the photo. A lot of law enforcement agencies don't. I've not worked for one that used that special software. The agencies that I've worked for have always just stored it on the server, because the officer's going to testify in court. This is a true and accurate representation of what I saw in court or what I saw at the scene.
right.
For us, what I recommend doing is download it and burn a CD. Again, it comes down to your testimony. Yes, I burned this CD on thus and such date, and it's accurate. It's an accurate preservation of the photo. there used to be, not as much now, but there used to be concern, well, could the photo have been altered? Because it's digital. Well, theoretically, anybody can alter a digital photo, but actually 35 millimeter and Polaroids can both be faked easily. They make, it's hard to find them now, but you used to be able to buy a Polaroid printer from a digital hooked up to your computer. So you could do a photo in Photoshop and print it on a Polaroid. So anything can be altered or tampered with, and it comes back down to your integrity. And this is my position, your integrity is saying this is an accurate representation of what I saw at the scene.
And of course,
Okay.
that's the legal threshold also when you're in court,
Yeah.
that they ask you, regardless if there's objections, they'll say, does this photo, accurately represent what you remember of the scene?
Right. Yeah, and I think consistency is important too. If they
Mhm.
question what your processes are.
Yes.
If you use the same process for the last 10 years, then it shows credibility, I guess.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Oh, you're welcome. And for me, I would testify that I use the same process I use at work. But I'm in that situation where I have both a law enforcement and a
Okay.
private side, but yeah, it's same process.
Okay,
I think that
thank you.
the main important word there is it's something that you do all the time. Even though you may have a flaw in what you do, if you do it the same way every
Yes,
single time,
yes,
that consistency will help you
Right.
in court.
yes.
Anything else? Okay. Well, Mike, I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of the association. You did an
Well, thank
outstanding
you.
job. Of course, I have about 1,000 other questions for you, but I'm sure we're going to have you back, if you don't mind, to
Oh,
do
happy
another
to.
presentation on some of these individual topics that there's
Oh.
much discussion to be had with them.
Happy
Again,
to, it's fun.
very good. Well, again, thank you very much. And thank you on behalf of the association, thank you all for attending this. If you have any additional follow-up, Mike will send out some paperwork via email, and you can also give him an email and ask any additional questions.
Yes,
And we'll be
yes.
glad to welcome him back. Have a happy, Merry Christmas
Yes.
and a
Merry Christmas,
Happy New
everyone.
Year. And thank you once again.
Thank you.
We'll
Thank
see
Thank
you.
you. Happy New Year. Merry Christmas, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Happy New Year.
Merry
Bye.
Christmas to everybody.
Take care. Merry Christmas.